The jet had 187 people on board, 3 engineers standing helplessly beneath its open engine panels, and less than an hour before the aircraft was supposed to carry a plane full of families across the country. Then a tired single father in a faded airport maintenance uniform walked past, looked at the silent engine for exactly 10 seconds, and quietly said the one thing nobody expected to hear: the problem wasn't in the engine at all. 20 minutes later, while executives argued and engineers searched through manuals, that same man climbed into the cockpit and started the aircraft that 6 highly trained specialists had failed to start. But what nobody at the airport knew was that the man had once been the youngest engineer in the company's history, and he had walked away from aviation years earlier after losing the person he loved most. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change a person, forgiveness can heal old wounds, hope can return after heartbreak, and everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so our family can keep bringing you stories that remind us there is still goodness in the world. The man's name was Everett Calloway, and at 38, he had learned how quickly a life could change. 6 years earlier, Everett had been the kind of engineer young technicians whispered about with admiration. He could hear an engine's irregular vibration before an instrument registered it. He could glance at a maintenance report and notice a pattern that everyone else had overlooked. He had helped design modifications for commercial aircraft, testified during safety reviews, and once received an award for preventing what could have become a catastrophic mechanical failure. But brilliance had never made him immune to grief. His wife, Maribel, had died unexpectedly after a long illness, leaving Everett alone with their 4-year-old daughter, Wren. In the months after her death, the world seemed to lose its color. Everett could still work, still solve equations, still understand machines, but he could no longer understand how to wake up each morning and pretend that everything was normal. So he resigned from his engineering position, sold his expensive house, moved into a small rented home near the airport, and became a single father whose greatest ambition was no longer designing aircraft. It was making sure his daughter had breakfast before school and someone waiting when she came home. Money became tighter every year. Everett did odd repair jobs during the day, fixed lawn equipment, repaired old generators, and sometimes worked on neighbors' cars. But none of it was enough to give Wren the life he wanted for her. When she was 10, Everett accepted a daytime maintenance position at a regional airport, not as an engineer, but as a general ground support technician. He checked service vehicles, repaired conveyor equipment, inspected portable power units, and handled whatever nobody else wanted to do. He never complained. He simply worked, came home, cooked dinner, helped Wren with homework, and listened when she talked about school. Yet when an unexpected vacancy opened for an additional daytime shift at the airport's maintenance department, Everett took it immediately. He needed the overtime. Wren had been accepted into a specialized science program, and Everett wanted desperately to afford the fees without telling her they were too much. Wren knew her father was tired, but she did not know how tired. She saw the small things, the way he sometimes fell asleep at the kitchen table, the way his work boots had worn through near the heel, and the way he kept repairing the same old jacket instead of buying another. One morning, she found him sitting on the front steps before sunrise, although the story itself stayed in the daylight hours that followed, with the morning sun already beginning to brighten the street. Wren sat beside him and handed him a folded envelope. Inside was her acceptance letter for the science program. Everett smiled, hugged her, and promised they would find a way. What he didn't tell her was that he had already decided to take every extra shift the airport could give him. That decision brought him to the airport on a bright Tuesday morning when the entire terminal was unusually crowded. A major storm system had caused cancellations across several regions, and hundreds of passengers had been rerouted through the airport. Among them were families with young children, elderly travelers, businesspeople rushing toward meetings, and a group of students traveling for a national robotics competition. The airport was under enormous pressure to keep flights moving. Everett was repairing a faulty ground power unit when he noticed something unusual on the far side of the apron. A large passenger jet had been pushed away from the gate but remained stationary. Maintenance trucks surrounded it. Engineers were moving quickly around the aircraft. Pilots stood near the cockpit stairs with worried expressions. Everett almost ignored it. He had learned not to interfere in areas above his position. But then he heard a familiar sound, a low mechanical whine coming from the aircraft's auxiliary power system. He froze. It happened again. Everett looked up from his toolbox. The sound stopped. Then it returned for a few seconds before disappearing. Something about the rhythm bothered him. It wasn't random. It was repeating. The aircraft belonged to North Star Meridian Airlines, one of the largest carriers in the country. It was scheduled to depart with 187 passengers, including children and families who had already endured hours of delays. A technical issue had appeared during startup, and the aircraft's main engines refused to engage properly. The first engineer suspected an electrical fault. The second believed the starter system was malfunctioning. A third technician had already replaced a component, but the problem remained. The aircraft had been grounded for nearly 40 minutes. Everett watched from a distance as the engineering team connected another diagnostic unit. He noticed the cockpit lights flicker for half a second. Then he saw something else. A ground service vehicle had been connected to the aircraft in a way that made the electrical readings appear normal even though the power transfer was unstable. Everett slowly closed his toolbox. He remembered that pattern. Years earlier, he had investigated a similar fault. It wasn't a single failed component. It was a chain reaction caused by an inconsistent ground connection combined with a protection system that was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The airplane wasn't refusing to start because something was broken. It was refusing to start because several systems believed starting the engines would be unsafe. Everett walked toward the engineering group, but one of the senior engineers immediately recognized him. Her name was Celeste Harrow, a respected aviation specialist who had once worked under Everett before his resignation. The moment she saw him, her expression changed. She remembered him. She also remembered the tragedy that had driven him away. Everett explained what he had noticed, but Celeste was under enormous pressure and initially dismissed the possibility. Everett didn't argue. He simply pointed toward the auxiliary power unit and explained that the readings were too clean. He believed the system was compensating for an unstable connection and creating a false sense of normality. Celeste checked the data again. Her expression tightened. The next several minutes became a race against time. The engineers tested the ground connection. It was faulty. They replaced it. The readings improved, but the aircraft still would not start. Everett noticed that the original diagnostic sequence had caused the protection system to lock out one of the starting circuits. Celeste tried resetting it through the approved procedure, but the system remained unresponsive. Another engineer insisted that the aircraft would have to be towed away for deeper inspection, which could delay the flight for hours. That meant hundreds of passengers would miss connecting flights, families would be stranded, and the airport's already overloaded schedule would collapse. Then the captain approached Everett. Captain Graham Vail was an experienced pilot with more than 2 decades of commercial flying behind him. He looked at Everett's maintenance badge, then at his face, and asked him what he thought. Everett hesitated. He knew exactly what he thought. But he also knew the consequences of being wrong. Still, he explained the sequence. The captain listened carefully and asked Celeste whether Everett's reasoning made sense. She reluctantly admitted that it did. The aircraft needed an authorized engineer to complete the final reset, but the problem wasn't merely technical anymore. It was procedural. The aircraft system had entered a protective state after detecting an abnormal sequence. The reset had to be completed correctly, with multiple checks performed in order. Celeste began the process, but a final indicator remained red. The system still refused to release the start command. Everett stared at the panel, then he remembered something. Years ago, he had designed a troubleshooting method for exactly this class of failure. It was never included in the standard training manual because it wasn't a shortcut. It was a diagnostic sequence that allowed technicians to isolate whether the aircraft was experiencing a genuine component failure or a false protection lock. Everett explained the sequence to Celeste. She stared at him for several seconds, then nodded. They followed the approved maintenance procedure carefully, using Everett's diagnostic logic to identify the underlying fault. The final warning disappeared, the cockpit came alive. For a moment, nobody moved, then the engine started, the sound rolled across the airport like thunder, and passengers watching from the terminal windows began cheering without even knowing what had happened. The flight was finally ready. But Everett didn't celebrate. He simply stepped away from the aircraft and picked up his toolbox. Celeste followed him. She asked him why he had never returned to engineering. Everett looked toward the terminal, where Wren was waiting in a public seating area because she had come to bring him lunch. He smiled when he saw her waving through the glass. Then his expression softened. He explained that after Maribel died, every aircraft reminded him of the life he had lost. He had spent years believing that leaving aviation was the only way to keep his daughter safe from losing him too. He had convinced himself that being a father meant abandoning the parts of himself that had existed before tragedy. Celeste understood something then. Everett had not stopped being an engineer because he had lost his talent. He had stopped because he was afraid that loving something again would give life another thing to take away. But the story took another unexpected turn that afternoon. The airline's vice president, Meredith Sloan, arrived after hearing what had happened. Meredith was not an emotional woman. She was known for being demanding, precise, and almost painfully direct. She had spent years believing that aviation depended on rules, systems, and measurable performance. When she learned that an ordinary maintenance worker had identified a problem that several senior engineers had missed, she demanded to meet him. Everett expected criticism. Instead, Meredith told him she had reviewed his old engineering record. She knew who he had been. She also knew why he had left. Meredith had once lost her younger brother in an unrelated aviation accident, and she had spent years blaming herself for not recognizing warning signs that others had missed. She understood Everett's fear more than she expected. She admitted that she had built her career around control because control was easier than grief. Then she offered Everett something he never expected, his old engineering position back, with flexible hours so he could continue caring for Wren. Everett almost refused. He had spent 6 years telling himself that the old Everett was gone. But when he returned home and found Wren sitting at the kitchen table working on a small robotics project, she looked up and asked him whether the airplane had finally started. Everett told her yes. Wren smiled and asked how. For the first time in years, Everett told her the truth. He told her that he used to be an engineer. Wren stared at him in disbelief. She had always thought her father was simply good at fixing things. She had never known that he had once designed aircraft systems and helped prevent dangerous failures. When she asked why he had never told her, Everett struggled to answer. Finally, he told her that sometimes people become so afraid of losing the people they love that they start shrinking their own lives to avoid another heartbreak. Wren reached across the table and took his hand. She told him that she didn't want a smaller life for him. That sentence broke something open inside Everett. The following week, he returned to the engineering department not as the young genius he had once been, but as a wiser man who had learned that success was not measured by how much pain you could survive alone. Celeste became his closest professional ally. Meredith changed the way she treated people under pressure. And Everett began mentoring young technicians, especially those who doubted themselves. Months later, Wren received a scholarship for her science program. She also built a small robotic aircraft model for a school competition. Everett helped her with it, not because he wanted her to become an engineer, but because he wanted her to understand something he had forgotten himself. The things we love do not betray us simply because life hurts. Sometimes they become the very things that help us heal. On the day Wren presented her project, Everett sat in the front row. Celeste sat beside him. Meredith was there too. When Wren finished her presentation, the room erupted in applause. Everett stood and applauded harder than anyone. For a moment, he imagined Maribel sitting somewhere beside him, smiling the way she used to when Wren was little. The grief was still there. It probably always would be. But it no longer felt like an anchor pulling him backward. It felt like a thread connecting the life he had lost to the life he was still building. And when Wren ran toward him afterward and wrapped her arms around his waist, Everett finally understood the truth that had taken him years to learn. A second chance doesn't always arrive as a miracle. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a broken machine, an unexpected job, a person willing to believe in you, or a child who reminds you that your story isn't over. Everett had thought he was taking a simple airport maintenance job to provide for his daughter. Instead, that job led him back to the part of himself he had buried beneath grief. He had once believed that walking away from aviation would protect Ren from losing him. In the end, returning to life taught both of them something far more important: you cannot protect the people you love by refusing to live. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us this. What part of yourself would you bring back to life if you were given a second chance? Maybe your answer will give someone else the courage to begin again, because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying a gift they buried years ago. Sometimes the quietest worker in the room has already survived battles nobody knows about. And sometimes the greatest miracle isn't starting a broken jet, sometimes it's finding the courage to start yourself again.